So in the last video, we talked about the three branches of the U.S. government, and in this video, we are going to be honing in specifically on the judicial branch. So just like the other branches of government, the judicial branch has two sides to it, the federal side and the state side. And both the federal and state judiciaries are structured in what's sometimes called a three-tiered structure. So in the high tier, you have a Supreme Court, which is also known as a court of last resort. And then you have the Appellate Court, which is also known as an intermediate court. And then at the bottom tier, you have the trial court, which is also known as a court of first instance. And so for the federal side of the judicial branch, the Supreme Court is simply known as the U.S. Supreme Court. And each state has its own Supreme Court or court of last resort. And most just follow the naming convention of calling it the state Supreme Court. So in Washington state, it is known as the Washington Supreme Court. Then for the federal side, the appellate or intermediate court is known as the U.S. Courts of Appeal. And these are sometimes, although incorrectly, known as circuit courts. The intermediate courts of the United States used to be called circuits. They are now called courts of appeal. However, their jurisdiction is over a region of the United States called a circuit, and so some people still refer to them as circuit courts. Washington's intermediate court is known as the Washington Court of Appeals. And then on the federal side of the judicial branch, the trial courts are known as U.S. district courts. And on the state side, there is a variety of naming conventions for trial courts. In Washington state, their trial court is called the Superior Court. And then there are also courts known as district courts. And the Superior Court is known as a court of general jurisdiction. And district courts are courts of limited jurisdiction. And many states structure their trial court system in this manner of giving one court general jurisdiction to hear all sorts of claims, and then there will be one or more courts of limited jurisdiction that can only hear certain types of claims. So, for instance, a Washington State District Court can only hear small claims, traffic infractions, and misdemeanors, whereas the Superior Court can hear all manner of cases. On the federal side, there is no federal courts of general jurisdiction, so all federal courts are referred to as courts of limited jurisdiction. Now, before we move on, I also wanted to alert you to the unusual naming conventions for the judicial branch in the state of New York. Because the state of New York, for reasons I don't fully comprehend, decided to call its trial court the New York Supreme Court. and that makes its appellate court the appellate division. The appellate division of the Supreme Court, and then its highest court, its court of last resort, is known as the New York Court of Appeals. And I tell you this because you will read a lot of cases from the state of New York, and I hope to spare you from the confusion that I suffered my first year of law school, as I kept reading about cases from the New York Court of Appeals that purported to overturn cases from the New York Supreme Court. And so if you encounter that same confusion, just remember the New York Supreme Court is the trial court in New York, the court of first instance, and the New York Court of Appeals is the court of last resort. So having covered all of that, let's go ahead and make a little diagram. So on the federal side, you have the federal trial court, then you have the federal appellate court, and then you have the federal Supreme Court. And then on the state side, you have the state trial court, you have the state appellate court, and you have the state Supreme Court. And so a case can either go the state route or it could go the federal route, and it will start in the trial court, and then the loser of that case can appeal up to the appellate court for the state, and then the loser of that case can appeal up to the state Supreme Court. If the case doesn't go the state route, it could go the federal route, and from the federal trial court, the loser appeals up to the federal appellate court, and then the loser of that case goes up to the federal Supreme Court. Now, if the case goes the state route, it can go all the way up to the state Supreme Court, the court of last resort, and from here, the loser can also appeal up to the federal Supreme Court, but only if the case involves a federal question. So you can go through the entire state process, and if you lose, then your final option would be to go up to the federal Supreme Court, but you have to raise a federal question. So looking at this diagram, you might ask yourself, how do I know whether the case goes to federal court or to state court? So if I have a case, does it go to federal court or does it go to state court? And your first instinct might be to say that a case goes to federal court if it involves federal law, and it would instead go to state court if it involves state law. And this is a perfectly rational way of structuring the judicial system in a federal republic like the United States. However, it is unfortunately incorrect. And this is an especially pernicious mistake because it will actually be correct much of the time. However, it is not the general rule. So the general rule of where a case goes and whether it goes to federal court or to state court is that all cases go to state court unless Congress says otherwise. And so the type of law that the case involves is actually not that important to deciding whether it goes to federal court or to state court. And in fact, state courts are perfectly equipped and able to decide questions of federal law, and federal courts likewise are able to decide questions of state law. And what many people don't appreciate is that Article 3 of the US Constitution, which describes the structure of the United States Judicial Branch, makes federal courts optional. If you go read it, all it says is that there is one Supreme Court of the United States whose composition and jurisdiction is entirely dictated by Congress, and then for courts below the Supreme Court, Congress has absolute discretion in deciding whether to establish them and whether to vest them with jurisdiction. So if Congress decided not to establish federal courts and to not give the U.S. Supreme Court jurisdiction to hear any cases, that would be constitutionally permissible. And in the absence of federal courts, the only place where you could bring a case would be state court. That said, it turns out that Congress has decided to establish federal courts and has vested those federal courts with jurisdiction. So let's talk a little bit about federal jurisdiction. So when giving a federal court jurisdiction, Congress has two options. It can vest the federal court with concurrent jurisdiction. And concurrent jurisdiction just means that a case can go to state or federal court. And this is the default rule if Congress merely vests a federal court with jurisdiction to hear a case. So if Congress vests jurisdiction in a federal court, the assumption is that the federal court shares jurisdiction with state courts, and the case can be brought in either state or federal court. Congress has another option, and it can give federal courts exclusive jurisdiction. And in order to give a federal court exclusive jurisdiction, Congress needs to not only vest the federal court with jurisdiction, but it must go a step further and strip jurisdiction from the state courts. And in this case, with exclusive jurisdiction, the case can only go to federal court. And so Congress has, in several different statutes, given federal courts jurisdiction to hear cases. So in Title 18 of the U.S. Code, Section 1331, Congress has vested concurrent jurisdiction for cases involving federal questions. So if a case involves federal law, it can be brought in federal court or it can be brought in state court. In Title 18 of the U.S. Code, Section 1332, Congress has also given federal courts jurisdiction for state questions if the parties are from different states and the amount controversy is greater than $75,000. And so federal courts have concurrent jurisdiction over federal questions, and then they also have jurisdiction over state questions if the parties are from different states and the amount in controversy is over $75,000. And so these are both examples of cases in which Congress has merely vested jurisdiction in federal courts, but has not gone a step further to strip jurisdiction from state courts. But we can see an example of this jurisdiction stripping in Title 18 of the U.S. Code, Section 3231, which gives exclusive jurisdiction for federal crimes. And so cases involving a prosecution for a federal crime can only be heard in federal court.